Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to a Reagan Forum hosted by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. The Center for Public Affairs offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day, from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. In this week's Reagan Forum, we present Mark Weinberg, a former spokesman, advisor, and speechwriter to President Ronald Reagan. In his new book, Movie Nights with the Reagans, Mark recalls his years as assistant press secretary to President Reagan and the weekends they spent together over 8 years watching films at Camp David. Mark was fortunate enough to make more trips to Camp David and to watch more movies with the Reagans there than any other White House staffer. The stories Mark shared at the Reagan Library on March 6, 2018, offered a rare glimpse in what life was like when the Reagans were at their best, unscripted and unburdened by the world, without a camera in sight.
Thank you, Joanne. The funny thing about that Rockney movie is how little Ronald Reagan was actually in it and how impactful it was. I forgot all about that. Joanne wasn't being honest with you. I don't have a large group of friends. So, well, thank you, Joanne, and thank all of you. It's a treat to see all of you. Before I begin, tell the truth by a show of hands. How many of you are here to see if I really do have a wife and children? Well, I do, and they're here. Now, stand up, let everybody see you. Come on. Take a good look. They're due back at the Warner Brothers prop department by 10. A reading from a book by Mark. Praise be to Simon Schuster. Okay, here we go. As pretty much everyone here knows, speaking from the podium is not my comfort zone. It's not what I'm most experienced in. I was the guy who made sure the podium was where it was supposed to be, then retreated to the back of the room with the press corps, or maybe to backstage with the staff. That was my comfort zone. So I apologize if I am something less than a great communicator, but I'll try. Before I begin, I would be remiss if I did not mention that today is 2 years exactly since Mrs. Reagan joined her husband. Would you join me in a moment of silence in her memory, please? Thank you. It is so special to be here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum. As you know, he loved this place. They both did, and I thank you, Joanne, for inviting me. Presumably, everyone here knows how to read. Well, most everyone, so I will not do a reading per se. Rather, what I thought I would do is spend a few minutes telling you about my book, why I wrote it, and what I hope some of the takeaways are, and then open this up for Q&A. I cannot imagine anything more dreadful than having to sit and listen to me drone on and on. Ask my wife and kids. And as many people in this room know, Ronald Reagan always said, it is better to have a dialogue than a monologue. So if that's okay with you, we'll do that. Now, I never intended to write a book about my time with the Reagans. Not that I did not cherish it, but first of all, I'm a little bit lazy, and secondly, I didn't think I had a story to tell. But as time went on and book after book, many excellent ones, were written about the President and Mrs. Reagan, it occurred to me that a piece of the picture was missing. No one was writing about what I thought was a very unique story and an important story, an important aspect of their lives together. How they were in private at Camp David and the movies they watched there. Now, it was my wife, Erin, who urged me to do this and to share that part of the Reagan legacy, and she pointed out two things. One, it was a story only I could tell. And two, it was the only story I could tell. Because I am not a policy person. I could not write a story about arms control or economic revitalization or rebuilding of the military. That's not where I was. But I had a unique vantage point and relationship over many years. And this time, Aaron was right. So I set out to share with everyone what the Reagans were like in private. Some in this room shared that experience. At their most relaxed, at Camp David, in a modest home with very few aides, no press, no ceremony, just them, as they did what they enjoyed most, watching movies in their living room there. Not surprising when you consider that they were both former movie stars and proud veterans of Hollywood. It was there that they met, began their lives together, and learned things that would help them be, in my humble opinion, the most successful and beloved first couple in modern history. To his credit, Ronald Reagan never shied away from having been an actor. He was proud of that. Now, some of us stuffed shirts on the staff were not as convinced, but he respected the movie business and even went so far as to say he did not see how anyone could succeed as president without having been an actor. Yeah, fine moment. I need not tell this gathering how some in the press used that against him. So one day I asked him what he meant by that, and he very articulately explained that in a television era, it was necessary to learn how to communicate with large audiences, how a gesture, a reaction, an expression could convey a message sometimes more effectively than the words you spoke. And he understood and mastered the technical demands of the modern-day presidency, sound, lighting, and staging. And that made it very pleasant for people like me when we were working, and there would be photo ops when we would say, "Sir, we have to wait for a moment while the photographer adjusts his lens or adjusts the lighting." And he would almost immediately launch into a story about how something similar had happened in his previous profession, was never impatient, was never irritated, and allowed professionals to do their jobs. As my kids would say, he totally got it. So I set out in this book to take readers behind the scenes at Camp David, literally into the living room of the Reagans as they watched and for the most part enjoyed so many iconic movies of the 1980s, like Top Gun, Back to the Future, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, On Golden Pond, Ghostbusters, Rocky IV, Oh God, Book 2, The Shape of War Games, yeah, among many others, and some of what the president called golden oldies, one of which we just saw. And I endeavored to share what they thought, how the movie may have impacted things, and how they related to what was going on in the country and in the Reagans' lives at the time. And I share some perspectives from a vantage point of an admittedly naive and stupid 20-something-year-old in a remarkable job, and how this truly wonderful couple was so warm, welcoming, and exemplary. As I wrote this book over the last 2 years or so and did the research for it, which include going through the Reagan's diaries, coming here to the library, and benefiting from the assistance of the remarkable staff here, there were moments when I literally had to look at pictures to prove to myself that I was really there. And I noticed how gray my hair had gotten, but at least it's still there. Some days it seems like a dream. Some days it seems like yesterday. And some days it seems like a million years ago. Perhaps the most gratifying aspect of writing Movie Nights with the Reagans came toward the end. Mrs. Reagan was kind enough to grant me an interview. I believe it may have been her last, for this book at her home in Los Angeles. You can read the introduction for details, but it was clear to me that she was excited about what I was doing and believed it was a story worth telling. She shared memories of their years together in Hollywood, commented about how the movie business prepared them for the White House, talked about how special the movie nights at Camp David were to her and her husband, and even under some gentle pressure from me, told me what her favorite movie was. I wish I had finished this book in time to deliver a copy to her. Things did not work out that way, but that's okay, because the legacy of Nancy and Ronald Reagan lives on here at this wonderful museum and library and presidential center, in patriots such as you, and I hope a little bit in books such as Movie Nights with the Reagans. Your being here today is indicative of your respect for and interest in an extraordinary man and woman who literally changed the world. Many of you today here knew the Reagans well and know that at the end of the day, despite their greatness, despite what they achieved, they were just people. And they never pretended to be otherwise. Great people, yes, but just people who, like many, many others, liked nothing more on a Friday or Saturday night to sit on a couch in their living room, put their feet up on an ottoman, and watch a movie. First with popcorn, and then later, as Joanne told you, with candy. And I hope that this book takes you there with them. I thank you for the opportunity to come here and share these memories with you. And now I would be delighted to answer any questions or respond to anything that may be on your mind. Thank you.
Okay. So it is our usual custom here to have people in the audience with microphones. If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. We are live streaming, so we need you to be on the microphone so Mark can hear you. I did want to tell Mark just a little story that happened this afternoon. Our phone rang, and our receptionist picked it up and said Reagan Foundation, and the person on the other end said, "I understand you have Mark Weinberg coming to the library tonight." She was taken aback. I wish she had said yes. But anyway, I think he's better than Mark Weinberg anyway, so.
Thank you very much.
So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you right here in the back, sir.
What was the favorite movie?
You know, you don't have to buy the book. I think he had three favorite movies, one of which is not mentioned in this book. I think he loved The Sound of Music. At least there were occasions when homework would be sent for him to do at night and he didn't do it, and he said, well, heck, Sound of Music was on last night. I know he loved the Rockney Picture, and I know he loved Hellcats of the Navy. Basically, he liked movies. He was a movie fan, and if it was entertaining and wholesome and not over the top, he liked it, and he would have been reluctant to pick a favorite because he didn't want to insult anybody in the industry. But I think those three probably were at the top of his list.
Okay, right here. Come on, we're going to need some other hands raising here. This is your chance.
Stand up. Hey, Mark.
Steve.
So, most of us only knew the Reagans in the White House. You got to see them behind the scenes. Were they different people, or was it the same? Was there a consistency to who they were and their personality?
They were exactly the same. There were not two Ronald Reagans or two Nancy Reagans. There just weren't. And when I first started with them, I thought there might be. I didn't quite believe that everything I had read about them was true, either in terms of their relationship with each other or how they behaved. But you would be with them in their living room, and it was the same person that you had been with in the office earlier in the week. It was exactly the same guy. Now, that's not to say he didn't understand what the role of the president was, that when it was time to take the stage and be the leader of the country, he could step up and be exactly what he was supposed to be. He understood that he was a symbol and that what people thought of him was often what they thought of the United States. But there were not two different people. What you saw was what you got. And you know, they say you should never meet your hero because you'll inevitably be disappointed. But it wasn't true in this case. They were exactly the same, and they didn't put on an act. You could be in an elevator with them, and they would behave the same way with each other as if they were on a stage with 40,000 people.
Over here.
Did the children participate in these movie nights?
Sometimes. Ron and his wife Doria visited Camp David occasionally. Maureen and Dennis did as well. Patty didn't, and Michael didn't. Ron and Doria also went up and horseback rode with their parents at Camp David, which they enjoyed very much. And there's a funny story in this book, I don't know if you got to it or not, about Ron and Doria riding with the Reagans. And Mrs. Reagan, Ron told me, never really loved horseback riding. She did it for years and years and years, but her husband was kind of, as he described it, blissfully unaware that she really didn't love it. But, I mean, bless her heart, she was a trooper and rode whenever her husband rode. Well, at Camp David, one weekend, Ron and Doria were up, and the president, they usually just walked slowly there because that was Mrs. Reagan's comfort zone. But the president wanted to have a little fun, and he started to trot or canter or gallop, and Mrs. Reagan is bouncing up and down and was very uncomfortable. And she shouted, "Honey, Doria wants to slow down." Well, Doria had no such desire. And Ron said, I looked at her to think, gosh, what is she going to do? But she did the right thing and didn't tell on Mrs. Reagan. And the president said, well, if she wants to slow down, then I guess we should. And so they slowed down because Doria, who was an experienced horsewoman, I guess, wanted to slow down.
More from a Reagan Forum with Mark Weinberg after this message.
The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation is the nonprofit organization created by President Reagan himself, and specifically charged by him with continuing his legacy and sharing his principles: individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. We must remain vigilant and work together to share these conservative principles with younger generations. Your role is critical to move our mission forward. Thank you for your continued support. Please visit reaganfoundation.org/give. That's reaganfoundation.org/give.
Now, back to a Reagan Forum with Mark Weinberg.
Mark, Barry Zeal, CNN. I'm kidding.
From Warner Brothers. Are you here from Warner Brothers to take them back?
Yes, I'm from the prop department.
Props.
Clearly, President Reagan had an appreciation for storytelling and the power of stories. Are there some moments as you reflect on your time in the White House where you saw that appreciation for the narrative utilized, where he influenced the messaging around the politics in his political life? You know, obviously there was such an impression from his acting career, and we see every day the power of the narrative. And he set the stage. He really set the bar the highest. Are there times, you know, that you reflect upon, that you look back and see where he really demonstrated the appreciation of the narrative?
It's not the question I gave you. Yeah. Seriously, what's your favorite color? Storytelling to him was very important. And in fact, he would talk about movies. What made a movie successful was essentially two things. One, that it told a story and had a hero to root for. But he would always like to illustrate his point with a story. He would talk about women's rights and women's places in society by telling the story of a man who was injured in an accident, and this fella, he was lying there somewhere, and this fella pushed everybody out of the way, the men and women, and said, "I know first aid, I know first aid." And then this woman came up and said, "Well, when you get to the part about needing a doctor, I'm right here." And he enjoyed that story and others because that's how it made a point. If you could relate it to something that was real. And he liked to tell stories about life in the Soviet Union, about ways of illustrating the difference, the story of a cab driver where somebody was in New York and got into a cab at the airport and asked the driver, what did he do? And he said, "Well, I'm a college student." And said, "Well, what are you going to do when this is all over?" And the kid said, "Well, I haven't decided yet." And then this person found himself in Russia a few years later and at the airport and got in a cab, and by chance there was a young person driving and said, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well, I'm a college student." "Well, what are you going to do when you get out of college?" And he said, "They haven't told me yet." And now I've done no justice to that because President Reagan could tell it in a way that was far more impactful, but the point of it is to say that if he could find a story or an example to make his point, he would always do it because he knew that storytelling is what resonated with people.
Over here.
Since we're here discussing his movies, did President Reagan ever tell you what his favorite movie role was? What he enjoyed doing the most? Or what was his favorite part?
I think it was Rockney, in the Rockney picture, Gipper, because it gave him the nickname that stuck with him for life, and he used it forever. He was very welcoming of being known the Gipper, but he liked making most of his movies. Oddly enough, and I didn't realize this until I did research for this book, other than the fact that he acted with his wife in Hellcats of the Navy, he didn't like making that picture because he complained that the studio cut the budget so much that it affected production. And in fact, he complained that they were more interested in keeping on budget than they were in making a great picture. I don't think he minded the role, but he never tired of being known as the Gipper. It was just one of those things that stuck with him. You can see, though, in a lot of his pictures that he was happy to be there. Some of it was typecasting, that there was just a happy, agreeable, pleasant person, which was not a particular stretch. At Hellcats, interestingly enough as well, that was a grimmer personality for him. Now, it wasn't as bad as The Killers, which was a role he played and didn't like because he was a villain for the first time and it just wasn't him. But I think he liked most of them.
Right here.
Can you give us any insight about his use of humor and his enjoyment of humor?
The most interesting thing about his humor was he loved to tell a story. I think he was happiest when there were 4 or 5 people standing around him and he was telling a joke. And if it were mixed company, it would always be clean. He would never, ever, ever tell anything inappropriate in front of women. He enjoyed hearing a joke. And the most interesting note that I would offer about him and humor also was a way of conveying a point. He would tell Gorbachev jokes that he had heard about the Soviet Union and was pleased that he got a laugh even through the translation. The most interesting thing I would say about Ronald Reagan and humor is no one had a greater sense of humor about himself than he did. He had a self-deprecating way. He could see himself portrayed on television or in movies in a humorous way that poked fun of him, and no one would laugh more heartily than he. He was very thick-skinned about it and enjoyed humor, and you would see his arched eyebrows and that laugh that he had. He enjoyed life, and he liked people, and I think humor was part of that.
We have a question back there.
It was interesting to hear about what the Reagans enjoyed, but a somewhat different question would be, and it might apply to one or both of them, regarding any one particular movie, perhaps more that they thought were really important, that had a real impact on the world.
Well, I don't know that they ever spoke of a movie that was impactful. There were movies that they would say, well, now everyone should see that. That was entertaining. We sure enjoyed that. I do know that War Games was one that had an impact on him because it confirmed the angst he had about nuclear weapons and the threat they posed to the country. And as hard as he was working to rid the country of nuclear weapons and to rid the world of the threat of nuclear annihilation, that movie pointed out to him in a very sobering way that something could happen by accident, which only affirmed his opposition to those weapons. It wasn't a movie that he saw and thought, gosh, nuclear weapons are bad, I ought to be against those. Well, he was always against those, but that had a sobering effect. I don't know that there was any movie that he really came out and said everybody in the country should see that because it conveys a message. He watched movies, they watched movies primarily to be entertained, to just exhale and to unplug and to relax and to be in touch with pop culture, because I think they knew that it was important for leaders of a country to know what pop culture was at the time. Otherwise, you're very detached in the presidency. It wasn't as if they could go into a theater and sit in the third row and watch movies. And I think when you are in touch with what everybody in the country is seeing, you have an advantage of being in touch with pop culture. And I think that's why they didn't see movies for political reasons or anything of that kind.
Right here.
I have so looked forward to seeing you. I have recently become a docent. At least I'm going to graduate on Monday.
Congratulations.
Next Monday. And, and I could hardly wait to get here to hear you, because I know that all the things that you got to see are so exciting. I wish I could have been there.
Well,
I wish I could have been there.
I hope this helps you get there in some ways.
But I am going to enjoy your book.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here. And I'm so enjoying all your comments.
Can you
tonight.
come with me on the rest of the tour?
Do you want me to come with you? Is that what you're saying?
I got a wife and 2 kids. No, I don't.
Well, I've so enjoyed. Well,
No, but
anyway,
thank you
I've
very
enjoyed
much.
your comments. I've enjoyed this evening, and I'm looking forward to being a part of the Reagan Library, which is a very high-class, classy organization, and I love Ronald Reagan.
Thank you very much. This is very kind of you, and this institution exists as a wonderful tribute to him. And I must say that writing this book was literally a labor of love.
She was my only plant for the evening. We have a couple of back there. Yes, right.
Yes, hi, good evening. I was curious, was President Reagan ever given an award by the Academy of Motion Picture, say at the Oscars for
Funny you should ask. No. No. And no, he was not. And that was a sore point. And it was one of the few times that I'd ever think I saw Ronald Reagan with his feelings hurt. He was a tireless advocate for the movie industry. As I indicated earlier, he was proud of having come from Hollywood. And he made more than 50 films. He was twice elected president of the Screen Actors Guild. He led the first strike, which forever changed actors' relationships with their employers. And he believed that the movie industry was a good place. I was on the Warner Brothers lot today. My children and wife and I took a tour and spent some time there, and I recall that that's where he said he was happiest because it was like a family feeling. He loved the movie business. And one day, as a former president in Los Angeles, we were talking in his office about the movie business, and he said, you know, you would think that given what I've achieved, and I took that to mean the presidency after I left the movie business, the Academy would have recognized it in some way. But unfortunately, politics has taken over good manners, and they never did. And it was clear that he felt, I don't know if snubbed is the right word, but certainly hurt by that, because he knew that the politics that he professed and the politics of the motion picture industry writ large were not necessarily in sync. That's not what he was saying. But he was saying it would have been nice for the Academy to say, we're proud of you, Ronnie, one of our own, the only one of our own, ascended to the presidency of the United States. And I'm sorry that they've chosen not to do that. I tried to start a petition a while back to get that to be done. It didn't happen. I can only ask you to think if President Obama or President Clinton had come from the movie industry, whether the Academy would be so reluctant to in any way honor one of their own. And he made his point, and then he wasn't one to dwell on the negative, but I know it hurt his feelings, and they should do it, and they still can. A posthumous honorary Oscar is within the power of the Academy to grant. Now, I'm not holding my breath, but who knows?
There was one back there.
I'm just curious if Mr. Reagan ever chose movies because they featured his friends. Were there any movies that he preferred to watch because his acquaintances or friends were featured as actors in those films?
Well, the truth is that Mrs. Reagan chose most of the movies for the weekend. She probably talked to him about it, but ultimately the selections came through her. Yes, that was a factor. George Burns was a friend of theirs, and he was in a movie they liked, Michael J. Fox. He was in a movie. But I would also say, too, that politics had nothing to do with it. We watched some movies at Camp David, at least 2, that had Jane Fonda in them, which was probably not the person who you would think would be first on Ronald Reagan's list of actors or actresses to watch. And in fact, looking at one of the president's favorite military aides here, I was reminded as I researched this book and spoke with many of them that the idea of going to a movie that starred Jane Fonda, and there were 2, was a bit uncomfortable for some of the service people who were in the room because of her history with the Vietnam War. But the Reagans did not look at movies on the basis of either punishing or rewarding a friend. They looked at movies on the basis of what they thought would be entertaining, what was being seen in theaters at the time. And we never released the names of the movies that they saw contemporaneously, lest there be a perceived endorsement. Nor did we want to have a Nixon-Patton situation where, oh God, he saw Patton the weekend at Camp David, now what's going to happen in Vietnam? We never came back and said what they had seen. The press stopped asking after a while. But they knew so many people in the motion picture business that it was sometimes hard to avoid people they knew or see them intentionally.
Right here.
Mark, who between yourself, who was in your 20s, and the president, who was in his 70s, would fall asleep in the movies more often?
It's not funny. It's not funny at all. I never knew him to sleep during a movie, ever. My recollection, and there are people here who can either back me up or say I'm wrong, was the screen would lower, the Reagan's eyes would go on the screen and not leave the screen until the movie was over, and then he would look at his watch to see what the running time was. And when I first watched movies with them, I would watch them watch the movies, and I realized that's useless because all they're doing is literally staring at that screen, and they didn't take their eyes from it, and they didn't look around the room, and dozing, absolutely never. Now, I did on more than one occasion, more often on Friday than Saturday, because by Saturday you had gotten some rest, but Friday night, people were tired. I mean, he wasn't, but we were, and there was more than one movie when I opened my eyes just at the strategic time when the lights came up, and on one occasion, and I wrote about it in the book, I fell asleep. It was Showboat, which is like the most boring movie ever made. I mean, it was really, they loved it, of course, but it just was dreadful. And I'm sorry, Howard Keel, and I fell asleep, and I didn't say anything in the post-movie commentary because there really wasn't much to say. I'm walking out of Aspen Lodge and say, I'll bet you were pretending it was a cabinet meeting. And that was, he knew. The younger people, the general answer to your question is the younger people were far more likely to doze than he was. And every once in a while, you would hear a head hit the table. At first they would look back, and after a while they stopped to look, and they knew. But not them. They didn't fall asleep. And he didn't fall asleep on helicopters or airplanes either. And you know this. He would love nothing more than on an airplane, on long flights, when staffers half his age would fall asleep, to go up to them, stand next to them, pose for a picture like this, and then send it to him later. He had amazing stamina.
Over here.
You kept us on the edge of our seat. You said you talked to Mrs. Reagan and asked her what her favorite movie was. And we're all probably wondering what the answer to that question is.
You have to buy the book. Sorry, man. Trying to put these kids to college, you know. Here's how that conversation went. So at the end, it was one of the things I didn't want to leave without getting an answer to. So I said, well, what was your favorite movie, Mrs. Reagan? Oh, well, there were so many. It's hard to choose. And part of that is because they had so many friends in the picture business that I didn't think she would necessarily want to pick one. I said, sure, you don't have anything that's your favorite? No, not really. I said, well, how about Donovan's Brain or Night into Morning, which were two in which she had starred? And she laughed and said, oh, no. I said, really? Nothing? No favorite movie? She said, well, any that Ronnie was in. And I said, okay, well, what would that be? And she said, well, I guess it would have been Hellcats. And it's kind of a predictable answer, but I actually think that's true. And they had fun recollections of making that because she recalled that in the scenes where she bade him farewell, her character was a nurse and his was a naval officer, and there was a scene that they were shooting and she was supposed to bid him farewell. And she couldn't do it without crying, which was not part of the script. So she would do the scene and she would start to cry. Cut, and then she'd start to giggle. And then they'd do the scene. Same thing happened over and over, and they finally got it right.
Any more questions? Okay, right here. Sorry. Who can get there first?
I know, right?
Okay, that's fine.
So, Mark, what is your favorite story about your time with the Reagans on movie night?
Well, there was one movie, and I don't know what it was. It might have been Red Dawn. For some reason, which I can't now recall in the discussion afterwards, I said something that seemed to favor the communists in the movie. I don't know why. I said, well, maybe their point was this or that. I said, probably to be contrarian. I don't know what I said or why I said it. But the president said in front of the group, well, you sound just like those people in the movie back there. And I said, oh my God, the President of the United States just painted me red. And everybody laughed, including him. And I didn't give it a second thought. The next day, radio speech comes and goes at 12:06. Everything is back to normal, business as usual. It just was one of those moments. Well, the next night, Saturday night, before the movie started, the president said, before everybody sat down, he said, say, last night I said something rather silly about Mark and the communists and so forth. I know he doesn't think that way. He's part of the family. And I thought that was awfully nice of him to say. I really wasn't bothered by the previous night's exchange. And I said to Mrs. Reagan later, I said, that was awfully nice of your husband to say, but he didn't have to do that. And by the way, he could have said something at the radio speech. And she said, well, we talked about that, but Ronnie thought it was important to say it in front of the whole group. And, this is not something that is fake or made up or is for cameras or public consumption. It was just who he was.
And speaking of who he was, one of my favorite stories in the book, Mark, and unless anybody has any other questions, this will be his last story. If you would tell us a little bit about the story, I don't want to give it away, where you stepped in for the personal aid, had the president sign a few things, and then the next day you were asked to come to his office?
Well, this actually occurred in Washington. He was at the White House from time to time in the second term. The personal aide asked if I would fill in for him on Saturdays for radio addresses, which consisted of meeting the president at the elevator in the residence, walking him along the colonnade to the Oval Office lest he get lost, being in the Oval Office during the radio address, which was handled by people from the White House television office, Flo Grace, Elizabeth Board, the military people from the Signal Corps and the network pool, and walking him back to the residence elevator and bidding him farewell. On this particular Saturday, it turned out that there were some documents that needed to be signed, some letters, routine correspondence of some kind or another, and I thought rather than have the president do so in the Oval Office in front of the gathered crowd, why, he could just do it in his office upstairs in the residence. So I rode up in the elevator with him. We walked into his personal office off the bedroom in the residence, and I said, Mr. President, they've asked me to have you sign these letters, and I handed him a pen, and he signed the letters. Have a nice weekend. And I took the letters back to the West Wing, put them on the desk of the personal aide, whose office was literally steps from the Oval Office, and went back about my business, went home, and didn't give the weekend the second thought until Monday morning at about 10:30, the direct line between our offices rang, and the personal aide said, he wants to see you. And I said, what? He said, he wants to see you. I said, what? Because that never happened, and it was virtually impossible that Ronald Reagan would come into the Oval Office and say, I need to see Mark Weinberg. There was no logical reason that would be the case. And I said, I'm sure he does. Thank you very much. I thought it was a scam. People kidded each other in the White House all the time about those things. And so I didn't go. I didn't go. And about an hour later, the phone rings again. He said, he really does want to see you. I'm not kidding. I said, all right, I'll be there. And I took my leisurely time, and I put my suit coat on. I walked up to the Oval Office, and by this time, the personal aide wasn't there, but the president's secretary was. And I said, he said he wants to see me. And she said, he does? She didn't know anything about it. And she said, well, let me go see. It was around lunchtime. She goes in and came out and said, he does. And I've always thought that she was a little bothered by the fact that she didn't know it, but who knows? So she said, go on in. So I go in, and the president's sitting at his desk, and he was having lunch or reading a paper or doing something. The guy says, Mark, come on in. I said, sir, you wanted to see me? He said, yes, I did. Now, about those letters that you had me sign over the weekend, and I thought, oh, God, I did something wrong. It screwed up in some fashion that was a problem. Then he opened the drawer to that resolute desk and said, you left your pen upstairs, and I didn't know if you needed this or this was special to you in some way, and I was going to call you, but I didn't want you to have to come back into work on the weekend, so here it is. And it was one of those pens that you would buy at a drugstore or get from the supply unit, and thank you very much, have a nice day, see you later. And I don't know whatever happened to that pen, and that was just who he was. And it reminded me, in the 1980 campaign, we were flying somewhere, and he wandered back to the airplane with an envelope in his hand and said, does anybody have a stamp? And anybody have a stamp? And I think Dottie Dellinger or Shirley Moore, one of the traveling secretary, said, well, yes, but what do you need a stamp for? He said, well, someone back there gave me a letter, and I wrote back to them, and I just wanted to mail it to them. And he had written the letter, addressed the envelope, and sealed it, and had every intention of putting a stamp on it and mailing it. And they said, well, we'll take care of that for you. So, of course, they took care of it and opened the envelope and Xeroxed his response so that there would be a record of it somewhere, and then carefully put it back in an envelope so that the recipient would get what the president intended. But it just never occurred to him that he was better than anybody else. He just didn't view life that he was anything other than Ronald Reagan. It was remarkable.
Yes, he was. I concur. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Mark last met with Mrs. Reagan in August of 2015. While discussing the book, Mrs. Reagan said to Mark, "That was such a special time." It was her last known interview before her death a few months later. Thank you for listening. Signed copies of the book can be purchased through the Reagan Library Museum Store. Every purchase you make from our catalog, website, or museum store is a critical component to our success. In short, your purchase supports our efforts to extend the legacy of President Ronald Reagan. Purchases can be made at reaganfoundation.org/store. To find a listing of all upcoming events, please visit reaganfoundation.org/events. For more information on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, including information on how to become a member, information on upcoming exhibits at the Reagan Library, and more information on the legacy of President Reagan, please visit reaganfoundation.org. And don't forget to like and follow the Reagan Foundation on all social media platforms.
Until next week, thanks for listening. God bless you.
Don't forget to subscribe to a Reagan Forum podcast in your iTunes or Google Play stores and on other podcast platforms as they become available. New episodes of A Reagan Forum come out every Thursday. Like what you hear? Check out our Words to Live By podcast, featuring radio addresses and speeches Ronald Reagan delivered from the 1960s through the 1980s. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And don't forget to follow @Ronald Reagan on Facebook, @Ronald Reagan 40 on Twitter, and Reagan Foundation on YouTube. Also, search for us on SoundCloud and Stitcher.